What in the hell has been going on at the Walt Disney Company in the last several months? Renegade Online. Well, welcome back, folks. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's great to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many folks watching this video that are not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias. And of course, please do leave a comment before you head out the door today. We have a lot to discuss. A recent filing with the United States Securities and Exchange Commission by the Walt Disney Company on Tuesday, January 17th, 2023, has seemingly shed some additional light on the entire Bob Iger v. Bob Chapek scenario and everything that's been going on at the Disney board. If you caught the Sunday live stream here on Valiant Renegade, then you probably already have a decent understanding of what's going on. We have activists, investors like Nelson Peltz from Trian Group. We have Bob Iger trying to still keep a stranglehold on the Walt Disney Company. Chapek, who has been ousted. CFOs like McCarthy, who may have played a vital role in it. But today, we have even more information of how far back this proxy fight goes with Nelson Peltz, who has been trying to get a seat on the Walt Disney Company's board of directors now for the last several months and is about to engage in an even bigger fight as we approach the annual shareholder meeting here in just the next 2 months or so. Let's cover some of the major players first involved in this report. First up, Susan Arnold, the current chairman of the board of the Walt Disney Company, who is about to conclude her 15th year on the board of directors. She was installed as chairman of the board on January 1st of 2022. Next up is Miss Safra Katz, a director on the board of the Walt Disney Company since 2018. Miss Katz has been a chief executive officer of Oracle since 2014, served as the president of Oracle from 2004 to 2014. Ms. Safra Katz currently is also the head of the audit committee of the Walt Disney Company. Next up is Ms. Amy Chang, one of the newest members of the Walt Disney Board of Directors. Amy Chang serves on the board also of Procter & Gamble and is an advisor to more than a dozen different companies. Mark Parker, been with the Walt Disney Company board since 2016. He's also the executive chairman and CEO of Nike. Yes, the same Nike that makes your Air Jordans. Mark Parker was also recently announced as the incoming chairman of the board for the Walt Disney Company when Susan Arnold steps down at the annual shareholder meeting here in just a few weeks. And then we have Mr. Robert Iger, a name that you are all probably very familiar with. Robert Iger has been with the Walt Disney Company since forever and a day ago. And Mr. Robert Iger had been chairman and CEO of the Walt Disney Company for many years, up to 2020, when he became a co-CEO effectively with Mr. Bob Chapek, who was recently fired from the Walt Disney Company as CEO back in November. Mr. Iger currently is on the board of directors, but no longer as chairman. He is serving a temporary term as CEO, as the board allegedly seeks to find a new CEO for once Mr. Iger's tenure there terminates once again in roughly 2 years. And then, of course, there's Mr. Bob Chapek, who was effectively CEO of the Walt Disney Company for a mere 11 months. Really, not even 11 months, probably about 10 months when all things are considered. Of course, the first 2 years of Mr. Chapek's tenure as CEO was marred by Mr. Robert Iger not wanting to leave the building, as it were. Quite literally, as we'll get into in just a bit, and that we've reported for quite some time, Mr. Iger was working behind the scenes to undermine Mr. Chapek every single step of the way, and this new SEC filing from the Walt Disney Company seems to confirm every single bit of that. And next up, is Christine McCarthy, Chief Financial Officer of the Walt Disney Company. Though she is not on the board of directors, she holds one of the most powerful and influential positions in the House of Mouse. Then there is Issac, Ike Perlmutter, who brought Marvel to Disney back in 2009 with a tremendous acquisition for the House of Mouse. And then later in 2015 was shown the door effectively by Kevin Feige and Bob Iger. He is still the chairman of Marvel Entertainment at the Walt Disney Company, but that is a title that is basically just ceremonial, as Kevin Feige no longer reports to him and has full creative control over everything that we've seen, particularly in Phase 4 of Marvel Cinematic Universe. And finally, we have Mr. Nelson Peltz, a billionaire investor and head of the Trian Management Group. Mr. Peltz has been trying to acquire a board seat at the Walt Disney Company for some time, and he is now set to engage into a proxy war with the board of directors at Walt Disney, asking for shareholders to grant him their votes for him to sit on the board of directors. And I believe it is the activity surrounding these events and this man, Mr. Nelson Peltz, that may have played a far greater role in the firing of former Walt Disney Company CEO Bob Chapek than we had previously suspected. There is a lot to ingest in this video. There is a lot to ingest from this report, even for somebody like me who's been doing this for a very long time. So I ask for everybody's patience and very careful attention, and make sure you stay watching this video all the way to the end, because it's critical. This from the January 17th, 2023 filing with the United States Securities and Exchange Commission by the Walt Disney Company, what they refer to as a background to the solicitation by Mr. Nelson Peltz, the CEO of Trian Management. On July 11th, 2022, Peltz, the CEO of Trian, met with Disney CEO Bob Chapek at the Disney Hotel in New York. On July 15th, just 4 days later, Peltz called Amy Chang, a member of the Walt Disney Board, to convey that he was supportive of Mr. Chapek and believed that he, Mr. Peltz, could be helpful if he joined the Walt Disney Board. That same day, on July 15th, as Mr. Peltz was talking with Miss Amy Chang, Walt Disney Board member, Ike Perlmutter, the chairman of Marvel Entertainment and former CEO of Marvel Entertainment, contacted Mr. Chapek and Christine McCarthy, the CFO or Chief Financial Officer of the Walt Disney Company, to encourage the consideration of Mr. Nelson Peltz of Trian as a director on the Walt Disney Board. Perlmutter also called Safra Catz. Safra Catz, who is the chair of the Walt Disney Company's Audit Committee, to advocate for adding Mr. Nelson Peltz. Perlmutter said that he and Mr. Peltz supported Mr. Bob Chapek, then CEO of the Walt Disney Company, and adding that Mr. Peltz to the board would help Bob Chapek counter recent headwinds that he had faced, solidify his position as CEO of Disney, and preempt any other potential shareholder nominations of director nominees at the 2023 annual shareholder meeting. He, Mr. Ike Perlmutter, said that without Mr. Nelson Peltz there on the board of directors at the Walt Disney Company, former executives, including Mr. Robert Iger, would be back at Disney. On July 16th, 2022, a day later, Peltz contacted Bob Chapek to express his desire to join the board once again. Peltz noted that he did not hold an investment in the Walt Disney Company, but he added that if he was made a board member, then he would make an investment in the Walt Disney Company. And on that same day, Mr. Ike Perlmutter, the chairman of Marvel Entertainment, and Mr. Nelson Peltz had a 1-hour conversation with Ms. Katz, the chairman of the Audit Committee for the Walt Disney Company, to advocate for Mr. Peltz to be added to the board. On July 18th, 2 days later, Ike Perlmutter contacted Horacio Gutierrez, who is Disney's top attorney, the senior executive vice president and general legal counsel, to continue to advocate for Nelson Peltz to be added to the board. This is where things begin to get a little bit more interesting. In October and November, members of the Disney board met numerous times to discuss governance and leadership matters, including concerns that had been emerging about Mr. Chapek's leadership and strategic vision, and whether he, Mr. Chapek, should continue as CEO of Disney, as well as succession candidates for the chairman role. The board had approached Mark Parker, a member of the board of Disney for 7 years and the current executive chairman of Nike, to ask him to consider taking the chairman role. Those discussions were ongoing, as was consideration of other potential candidates from the board. On November 8th, 2022, this is when we covered the earnings call live here on Valiant Renegade of the Walt Disney Company. Disney conducted its full fiscal year and fourth quarter 22 earnings call. Afterward, Mr. Nelson Peltz of Trian called Mr. Bob Chapek to inform him that his management company, the Trian Group, had acquired a position in Disney totaling at the time approximately $500 million, with the intent of increasing this position of up to $1 billion. Mr. Peltz subsequently called Bob Chapek and informed him that the group intended to nominate a slate of nominees to Disney's board at the 2023 annual meeting, unless Disney agreed to add him, Mr. Nelson Peltz, to the board of directors. On November 10th, 2 days later, Mr. Ike Perlmutter of Marvel, the chairman of Marvel Entertainment, again reached out to Ms. Katz, the chair of the audit committee for the Walt Disney Company, Mr. Chapek, the CEO at the time, and Ms. Christine McCarthy, the chief financial officer, Mr. Gutierrez, who is Disney's top lawyer and general counsel, to advocate for Mr. Nelson Peltz to be added to the board. Following the company's earnings call, Mr. Nelson Peltz invited Bob Chapek to have lunch with him in his home in Palm Beach, Florida. On November 12th, Mr. Chapek met separately in Palm Beach with each of Mr. Nelson Peltz and Mr. Ike Perlmutter, and they continued their discussions to encourage the addition of Mr. Peltz to the board. In the post-earnings call time period, Nelson Peltz of Trian also had several conversations with Christine McCarthy. This is the first time that this report notes that Mr. Peltz had direct individual conversations with Miss Christine McCarthy, the chief financial officer of the Walt Disney Company, in which Mr. Peltz repeated that if he was not added to the board, he would run a proxy contest. Disney CFO McCarthy offered to meet with Mr. Peltz in New York City on November 28th. Remember that date, along with Mr. Gutierrez, the chief legal counsel for the Walt Disney Company, but Mr. Peltz was not available and then asked for the meeting to be moved to November 23rd, 2022. On November 17th, at a special meeting of the board called for this purpose, the Disney board met to discuss the ongoing approaches from Mr. Ike Perlmutter, the chairman of Marvel Entertainment, and Mr. Nelson Peltz. The board determined that to ensure that the Disney board was able to guide the discussions with Mr. Nelson Peltz, from that point forward, Christine McCarthy and Mr. Gutierrez, the chief lawyer of Disney, would be the designated points of contact with Mr. Nelson Peltz, and should both be involved in any further conversations with him. So there you have it, right there in plain language. Just 3 days before Bob Chapek was publicly fired and humiliated by the Walt Disney Company, the board made a decision that the only people that could possibly speak in an official capacity for the Walt Disney Company going forward and negotiate with billionaire activist investor Nelson Peltz of Trian Group was Christine McCarthy, the chief financial officer of the Walt Disney Company, who allegedly was also working to remove Bob Chapek, and Horacio Gutierrez, the chief lawyer of Disney. That was it. Nobody else could talk to him. Bob Chapek's name wasn't even brought up, and he was still, at that moment, the CEO of the Walt Disney Company. If at this point you haven't figured out that Bob Iger had his hands all over this from behind the scenes just 3 days before he was reinstalled as CEO of Disney, you've been missing the boat. Let's keep going. On November 20, 2022, the board of the Walt Disney Company made the decision to terminate Walt Disney CEO Bob Chapek and reappoint Bob Iger as the CEO of Disney and as a member of the board of directors. Disney announced these changes on the evening of November 20th, and following such announcement, it became public in various news articles that Mr. Nelson Peltz of Trian had amassed a stake of over $800 million in Walt Disney at that time, and he was now seeking a seat on the board of directors. This is when the news became public, folks. And here's the kicker. According to some news outlets, Mr. Peltz did not support Bob Iger's return as CEO. Now, the next several sections of this timeline really are just a big back and forth between Nelson Peltz and the Disney board. What do you want to do? I want a board seat. Give us some specifics. Let's talk. It goes back and forth until we get to one of the last entries and one of the last very pertinent pieces to this. On January 11th, 2023, Susan Arnold and Mr. Gutierrez called Mr. Peltz to thank him again for his time and for that of his crew at Trian, and said that although the board did not agree with his data sets utilized to assess Disney's financial performance or Mr. Peltz's perspective on the company, the board wanted to find a path for constructive engagement that would avert a proxy contest. Susan Arnold noted that Mr. Iger had only returned to the company as CEO 7 weeks earlier. There were significant changes occurring at Disney, and the board believed that the management team under Bob Iger's leadership should be afforded time to execute, and was concerned about disrupting management from the task ahead with the addition of Mr. Peltz as a director at this time. Now, sorry folks, I find that personally hilarious because as much as the board allegedly seems to be lamenting the lack of time that Mr. Iger has to implement his own vision, apparently that same courtesy wasn't given to Mr. Bob Chapek, who effectively only had 10 months at the Walt Disney Company to try to change anything before he was renewed in June and then subsequently fired almost inexplicably just about 3 months later. Susan Arnold said that in the hope of reaching a compromise, that Disney would be prepared to enter into an agreement with Nelson Peltz and Trian that would afford him the opportunity to receive non-public Disney information and meet with management and the board of directors at Disney on a quarterly basis to discuss strategy and other issues so that they could establish some mutual understanding about Disney's business. There was no reference or offer of a board observer seat, and the word observer was never uttered by Miss Susan Arnold or Mr. Gutierrez. Mr. Nelson Peltz rejected this offer and said he would not be muzzled and that the Trian Group would be proceeding to a proxy contest immediately. So let's read between the lines of semantics, shall we? The chairman of the board, Susan Arnold, and the top Disney lawyer, Mr. Gutierrez, apparently offered, by their own language in this SEC report, to afford Mr. Nelson Peltz of Trian inside information on Disney, seeing notes and classified corporate documents from the board and from management, provided that he was willing to sign an NDA or a non-disclosure agreement, but then in the very next sentence seemed to tell us that he was not afforded an observer opportunity and that the word observer was never used. Well, maybe the word observer was never used, but it sure as hell seems like you offered him a chance to observe all of the internal documents at the highest corporate levels of Disney, provided that he didn't say anything to the public. I don't know what else you would call that apart from an observational perspective. I Try to figure that one out. I'm sure there are lawyers that can twist this into a pretzel for us. So now let's put all the pieces together. We know that in January of 2020, that is when Bob Chapek's sole tenure as CEO of the Walt Disney Company was slated to begin. But shortly after, because of the pandemic that occurred a couple of months later, Bob Iger reinserted himself as a quasi-co-CEO of the company, kind of refused to leave. And even more information that we have uncovered this week that, frankly, we didn't know about before. But according to Mr. Nelson Peltz's own report, Restore the Magic, in it, he discloses that indeed in 2017, at the previous renewal of Mr. Iger's contract with Walt Disney as CEO and executive chairman, that part of those provisions included a 3-year contract to be an advisor or a consultant to the Walt Disney Company following his retirement. That would have been subsequently renewed down the line. And when Mr. Iger did retire in 2020, quote unquote, this may have been why he even refused to leave his office in the Burbank C-suite of the Walt Disney Company, still there to this day. He has been kept on as a consultant in an official capacity with the Walt Disney Company, and as we have been reporting since then, has seemingly been working from the inside, stirring up the pot, basically working against Mr. Bob Chapek every step of the way since Mr. Chapek has really assumed full control on January 1st of 2022 after Robert Iger resigned and retired as executive chairman following his sort of retirement as CEO in 2020. 2 years before. Bob Chapek only got 11 months to actually try to enact his own vision for the Walt Disney Company, something that was incredibly short-lived, and then just a few months after his early renewal, something that was a bit of a surprise from the board of directors at the Walt Disney Company. Now we see Miss Susan Arnold allegedly making a statement of sorts, at least through the legal counsel of the Walt Disney Company, Mr. Gutierrez, that now is not the time to have somebody like an activist investor such as Nelson Peltz come into the fray, because Mr. Iger has only had a few months to try to enact his latest vision to the Walt Disney Company. Of course, that's after him being there for nearly 2 decades in an executive capacity. One has to scratch their head and wonder, one just doesn't match the other here. This is just no. But when it also comes back to walking down through memory lane, Mr. Ike Perlmutter's name coming up in this report was something of a, frankly, tremendous surprise. Yes, Ike Perlmutter has still been lingering around Disney these years, although in a ceremonial capacity, more or less, as we stated earlier. And that is as chairman of Marvel Entertainment. Once again, to remind folks, back in 2015, when Ike Perlmutter was shoved out the door as having any real legitimate control over Marvel and its future, thanks to Kevin Feige and thanks to his collaboration with CEO at the time, and now once again, Robert Iger, Ike Perlmutter probably has an axe to grind with Bob Iger, and not a surprising axe at that. But when you really look at it, with the 2 people that Peltz communicated with initially and almost solely to begin this process of trying to become a board member of the Walt Disney Company, it was Bob Chapek and Ike Perlmutter. Now, Ike Perlmutter's position as having sold Marvel to Disney and being a Disney stockholder likely engenders him, and very much contractually, to being able to hang around at the Walt Disney Company for as long as he may so desire. And this is why his position at Disney is probably nothing more than ceremonial. They probably can't push him out the door entirely, have to keep him around on the payroll just based on what they're obligated to from a legal perspective, but he's obviously become a thorn in the side of Bob Iger. And Ike Perlmutter might be one of the next guys that Iger tries to release from duty if he even can. And what about Nelson Peltz of Trian? Apart from being an activist billionaire investor, his reasoning for wanting to change the trajectory from the business side of things at the Walt Disney Company is probably not the only thing that rubs somebody like Robert Iger the wrong way. Nelson Peltz was somebody who threw a $10 million fundraiser for one Donald J. Trump and his reelection bid in 2020. In fact, that was held in his Palm Beach, Florida home at that point. Now, if you haven't put two and two together on that front either, let me help you. If you're a big billionaire in Palm Beach, Florida, and you're throwing fundraisers for Donald Trump, you're probably also very good friends with one Governor Ron DeSantis, somebody else who is now running for president in 2024. And as a reminder to folks, it was Bob Iger who was back in the chair as CEO at the Walt Disney Company, who was once contemplating a run for a presidential bid that dragged Disney to the left because he wanted the nomination of the Democrat Party, not the Republican Party, as Mr. Peltz has been so fervent to support over the last several years. All of this is starting to come into focus, and I think this is probably what was the last nail in the coffin for Mr. Chapek, because Bob Iger had been working, as we said, behind the scenes for so long to probably try to get him out, and this Mr. Peltz issue and Trian Group might have been the last straw, because I frankly find it very interesting who Mr. Peltz decided to befriend and really communicate with. Mr. Peltz became very favorable towards the leadership of Bob Chapek at the Walt Disney Company. Bob Chapek, who some out there in the media and the social media universes have said is a big wokester at Disney and has made a mess of things. Then you have to ask yourself, why does a guy like Nelson Peltz, who is clearly a big mega Republican donor and bundler for that party, why would he be supporting somebody like Bob Chapek? Why would he be communicating with somebody like Ike Perlmutter as a go-to? Why would Nelson Peltz then also choose to avoid, until much later in the process, communicating with somebody like Chief Financial Officer of the Walt Disney Company, Christine McCarthy, who we've discussed here before on this channel, myself and WDW Pro, that McCarthy, frankly, is allegedly, reportedly, kind of a snake and kind of somebody who is only out for her own best interest. And it's come to light in a recent Hollywood Reporter article based around this SEC filing that Christine McCarthy and Bob Iger probably don't have too much love for each other either. Now, this article talks about the relationship between Nelson Peltz and Ike Perlmutter and how it's gone on with Chapek and Iger. A lot of what we've just discussed, but let's look at a few key pieces from this THR write-up. At age 80, Nelson Peltz is old enough to remember one of the most successful shareholder revolts in corporate history, namely at the Walt Disney Company. Presumably, he also knows that he is no Roy Disney and CEO Robert Iger, back on the job only since November 21st of 2022. He's nothing like the increasingly imperious and isolated Michael Eisner of 2004, speaking of Iger. But together, he and his friend Ike Perlmutter, the former Marvel Entertainment CEO who has some scores to settle with Bob Iger, dating back to 2015, can represent a tenacious, expensive, and distracting problem for Bob Iger and the Walt Disney Board at a time when the entertainment company faces the same massive challenges affecting other legacy entertainment companies. This development adds pressure as the company faces a 2-year ticking clock to find a successor for Bob Iger, and an effort led by Disney's new chairman, Nike executive Mark Parker. It may also restrict Iger's ability to maneuver as he might have wanted. At the time Nelson Peltz approached Chapek, he was dealing with a CEO who had been absolutely convinced that just 1 month earlier, that he was about to face execution by the Walt Disney Board. It's understandable that at the time, Bob Chapek might have felt that he could have used a friend or two, and that seemed to be an offer. Mr. Perlmutter said that he and Mr. Peltz supported Mr. Chapek, and that adding Mr. Peltz to the board would help Mr. Chapek counter the recent headwinds that he had faced, solidify his position as CEO, and preempt any other potential shareholder nominations of director nominees at the 23 annual meeting. Why would there be concern about headwinds for Bob Chapek at that point? That was July 15th of 2022. That was more than 2 weeks after Bob Chapek had been renewed as CEO. What were the headwind concerns? Why would there have been headwind concerns for Bob Chapek at that point, who had already been renewed for the next 2+ years? Obviously, it had been known behind the scenes that Bob Iger was still making plays to get back into the job. Bob Iger apparently had gotten bored. He was still sitting in his same office in the C-suite with his consultant role with the Walt Disney Company, as he had contractually with his original retirement agreement from 2017 that we mentioned earlier. Something was definitely going on. And it was probably an instance of somebody like Christine McCarthy, who has her own designs on maybe one day becoming CEO of Disney. And of course, Bob Iger, who at the time wanted to get back in. But if somebody like Peltz got involved, who obviously did not want Iger to come back into play, and Perlmutter, Ike Perlmutter at Marvel, did not want Iger to come back into play, he saw problems. And it was at that point that I think it seems like he ramped up his efforts to get Bob Chapek ousted as soon as possible after that. And the real stirring of the pot began. But not to be lost in this drama is Disney Chief Financial Officer Christine McCarthy. And this next piece in this same article from The Hollywood Reporter is starting to make things even a little bit more clear. Following the termination of Bob Chapek, Robert Iger lost no time in purging Chapek's deputy, Kareem Daniel, who he dismissed at 6:30 a.m. after the surprise Sunday evening announcement that Bob Chapek was out. And some sources with knowledge of Disney politics believed he was not done, meaning Iger. They believed that Iger wanted to ease out CFO Christine McCarthy, but much more gently than Chapek and Daniel. Press reports have portrayed Christine McCarthy as the one who raised alarms about Chapek's management with the board in September, and who subsequently called Iger to gauge his interest in returning. But some veterans of the Walt Disney Company's wars don't buy that scenario. Quote, "The board didn't know until she told them? That smells fishy to me," says one, who notes that this version of the story makes the board look very innocent and certainly not responsible for the bad things that happened when Chapek was CEO. In the wake of Bob Iger's return, some sources believed that CFO Christine McCarthy was vulnerable for having backed Bob Chapek too enthusiastically until she didn't. The reorganization that gave Kareem Daniel, then the chief of distribution at the Walt Disney Company, the power of the purse, increased her sway, Christine's sway, as well. All the various divisions' chief financial officers reported to her, Christine McCarthy, and Kareem Daniel. One Disney veteran believes that Christine McCarthy was positioning herself to expand her influence still further. As the Wall Street Journal reported in December, McCarthy had spearheaded a move to hire the consulting firm McKinsey last year to explore cost-cutting measures. McCarthy's passion for cutting costs had already led to some clashes with creative executives who Iger most wants to protect. McCarthy reveled in the expanded power of corporate, says one Disney veteran. She had probably enjoyed more power and influence in the company than at any time in her career. The hiring of McKinsey was her idea, and they hired McKinsey with an absolute agenda. Now, as I told you when we started, this was going to be a very information-heavy video. And as we've talked about before, the hiring of McKinsey was probably one of the things that was used at least as an excuse to get rid of Bob Chapek, the cost cuttings, the layoffs, the hiring freezes, all of that kind of stuff. That was all reported as being a Chapek idea. But this article from The Hollywood Reporter seems to suggest that their sources are saying that this was all Christine McCarthy's idea as CFO. And as we've stated in previous videos and live streams, and as we've stated before in this video, Christine McCarthy is somebody who is out for herself. She is out to secure her own position and build her own future. And I think to this point, not only did she probably throw Bob Chapek under the bus, but that's that same reason that is now also giving Bob Iger some concern, which is why this article seems to reference that he is looking to get rid of her next, albeit a little bit more cautiously and calmly than was Bob Chapek. Now, to be sure, there's a lot more to discuss, not only from this Securities and Exchange Commission report that the Walt Disney Company filed on January 17th, but also from the rebuttal, let's call it, from the Trian Group, headed by billionaire investor Nelson Peltz, and his website Restore the Magic, referring to the Walt Disney Company. Just too much to get into one video, but I do appreciate if you would leave some comments below with your thoughts with where this is going. And if you want to find out more information and get into an even more detailed discussion, make sure you check out Renegade Online, our live show here on Valiant Renegade, Sunday afternoons at 5 p.m. U.S. Central Standard Time. We hope to see you there. I'll be joined once again by WDW Pro of thatparkplace.com and maybe a few other guests. Stay tuned, hit that like and subscribe button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias, and until next time, take care.